Hi everyone, it's Chris from Punk Paisley, and I have a few video ideas that I definitely know I'm going to be doing in the coming days and weeks, but I had this quick idea that I definitely want to do a dump of because it came to me pretty quickly. I was struck by the hand of mayhem. The punk rock gods tapped me on the shoulder and whispered in my ear, and I'm going to listen. This is stuff that's fuzzy memory theater. For some of you who were there, a very small number of you who were there, you will remember these things. I hope that it kindles some memories for you. Maybe you can contribute in the comments. Certainly let me know the things I forgot, and certainly let me know when and how my recollections are fuzzy. I'm going to review what seemed to me the biggest, or at least the 10 obvious which come to mind, controversies within punk rock in the 1980s and perhaps leaking into the early 90s. And actually the latter and number one on the list ends up being fairly well genre defining and has had massive impact on all of the music that we've had since. So if you're my age and you were there and you were following these things, check me on what I remember and what I'm misremembering. And if you weren't and you're younger, consider this a history lesson. Sit down a while, folks. This is going to take a little while. We start with number 10, which is going to require explanations within explanations. I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. But that would be the ongoing multiple zine rolling argument that may have gone on for a year or two between Diamanda Galas and Church of Satan head Anton LaVey. And you may be asking, what does this have to do with punk rock? Well, I'll tell you. There was a much smaller community and a much bigger tent in alternative and indie music and press at the time than there is now. These are very important things to remember. You have to remember that in the early 80s, you may have some drunken skate punk band playing on the same bill as two straight edge bands because the community was so incredibly small that any and all of these people might be playing together. There might be a horror punk band on the bill, and there might be a straight edge band, and there might be a crossover band, and there might be a pop punk band, all on the same bill. There might be a joke band and a political band playing the same show just because they were the people in the community, and there may have been one venue. There was more cross-pollination. There was more people having to pay more attention to each other. Once things got bigger and the scene got larger, people had the luxury of being able to subdivide into smaller groups. Some zines and audiences split off from each other. Some groups of people stopped talking to each other. Some kids coming up came up at a time when some of those sub-scenes were formed, and that's all they knew, and that's what they grew up with, and to them, this was punk rock. And this over here, they didn't know what that was. So I feel fortunate that I was old enough at a time, or at least paying attention in my early teens, in my tweener years, early enough that I was catching a whole bunch of stuff all at the same time. And what you had, especially in the 80s, was zine culture. Yes, there technically was an internet, but this was bulletin board services, this was dial-up. I don't even know if 1% of the United States was participating, and within that, not even 1% of those people, we're talking like, not even 1/1000th of the United States, to give an example, let alone the rest of the Western world, would have been participating in any sort of alternative music discussion in any sort of bulletin board service-based pre-World Wide Web internet. That just doesn't exist. So things are happening at the pace of stamps, mail, snail mail, zines showing up in your local record store, or if you were fortunate enough to have a Tower Records near you, especially as the 80s progressed and the 90s started, Tower Records would lose a bunch of money because they had some excellent zine buyers who would make sure that every store in the country was stocked with the most obscure publications imaginable. That was pretty awesome. And in fact, a lot of times they'd go unsold, and they'd do the thing that newsstands and comic book stores and magazine shops, drugstores that sold magazines going way back used to do, which was to get rid of remainders. They would slice the masthead, slice the title of the publication off to indicate that it had not been sold, and they'd dump it. They'd often just dump them outside. There were days walking down South Street in Philadelphia when Tower was dumping their zines and magazines. I would stuff as many as would fit in a backpack of things that I were interested in. So you also had zines about zines, like Fact Sheet 5. I intend to do one or more videos just about zines like that. Fact Sheet 5, you had your Amok Dispatch, and you had all of these people with radical ideas, a lot of them diametrically opposed radical ideas, who were sharing ideas, often in the form of argument, in the letter sections and via interviews, often in very delayed fashion, because these are haphazard interviews. These are publications that are coming out 6 times a year, 5 times a year irregularly. Very few were coming out monthly. In the United States in particular, there was not this culture of, say, NME that you have in Britain or some of the other weekly music publications. That was something that was not really big even at a national big act level. I mean, Billboard magazine, I guess, for industry insiders, if you wanted to discuss Lionel Richie and Madonna, Poison, whatever, that would be in the pages of those. But any sort of slightly even alternative type thing, like you would get in New Music Express in Britain, not really a thing that existed in the US. You were lucky to have a monthly like alternative press or that sort of thing, and those were not dependable. When you had a feud that was going on, and this applies not just to number 10, but to a lot of the things on this list, it could stretch for months. It could stretch over the pages of the letter sections and the opinion columns in multiple publications and through interviews, and you would get all of the sort of commenting about commenting that you get now. The same effect as stitching TikTok videos or response videos on YouTube was taking place at the speed of mail. And it was taking place in publications that not all of which offered subscription services, but even if they did, you're getting those once a month, once every 2 months. A lot of times you would have to read multiple publications to get an idea of what the scuttlebutt was going on in that world. I used to primarily get my zines from 3 or 4 places, one of which was called Avril 50, I suppose would be how you would pronounce it. It was a coffee shop and magazine shop run by an Iranian immigrant across the street from Penn's Law School in West Philly. And that was one of my main haunts. There used to be a place called Pulpy, which was off of South Street in South Philly, beginnings of South Philly, Center City, border area, South Street, where they would have more publications than they had music. They may have also served coffee, that sort of thing. And then there were a couple of record stores that were my big record stores, and there was the Tower Records. There were 2 Tower Records that I would go to. There was the primary one at South Street that had the biggest zine section, and then there was one in Northeast Philly that I wouldn't go to all the time because that was even farther north than where I live, so in the opposite direction of Center City and West Philly and capital K Culture. I was buying 10 zines a month, probably at $1 to $2 a pop. There were free copies of The Village Voice, even though it's a New York publication, in boxes in Philadelphia. I'd read that once a week, and there were 2 free Philadelphia weeklies that I would read once a week. That were somewhat connected to this culture. Like they would carry Zippy the Pinhead comic strips, and there was some overlap. Joe Bob Briggs movie reviews. There was a little bit of overlap between the independent weekly newspapers and the zine world, especially because you're still doing everything by telephone. You're still doing things by voicemail boxes. And mail, snail mail, and weekly publications. You wanted to know what was at the movies. You wanted to know who was playing a show near you. You're opening the free weeklies and you're reading the ads. You're reading the ads that bars took out about who was playing there that week. You're listening to college radio. You can't watch. MTV isn't going to tell you about the punk bands coming into town. You're listening to maybe a couple of college radio stations in town. In our case, it was WXPN, which was Penn, still is Penn's radio station. However, it was a smaller wattage on a different frequency and definitely more community oriented. And you had WKDU, which still exists to this day, Drexel, and if you were, depending on where you are, you could also pick up Princeton's radio station, WPRB, to get some idea of what was going on places. So that's how culture worked, and word of mouth, and posters on 8.5 by 11 photocopies stapled to poles would also tell you that things were happening. So you had to look up a little bit too. Totally different world. Pre-cell phone, pre-internet. I know I sound like an old man, but if you like the punk rock, if you like this kind of culture, that's how this kind of culture was disseminating. And think about that. Think about that when you're thinking about this band influenced this band. Well, how did that have to happen? It was not just listening to somebody's Bandcamp or their YouTube video like it is now. And you couldn't hear samples of things. So I was reading a whole lot of different stuff, and if I couldn't find any punk rock stuff, or I got a free copy of, there were some more serious zines. They seemed a little more adult, which meant that the people may have been 22. You know, there were these 22, 23-year-old art school grad students who were more typically going to be into goth things and industrial music and that sort of thing. And those publications to me, even though they were also small print run zines, whatever, just seemed very much more adult. It's funny, they seemed like they had starker black and white graphics to me, even though I was living in a world where everything was black and white graphics, because hardly anybody had the budget for color printing. More about that later. This was that world, and in that world, there was Diamanda Galas, who I would read about more, who came out of sort of a jazz background, has an exotic, specific variety of soprano voice, had worked with Stanley Crouch, had worked with some serious musicians doing avant stuff. And I would read about these things, but also, you know, I'm 15, 18, 20 years old. I don't have a big entertainment dollar. You don't know what things sound like. I know I'm going to enjoy the next Dead Kennedys album, so I'm going to buy that when that comes out. Diamanda Galas, I have read about what she sounds like, but I don't know what she sounds like because I don't know somebody who owns one of her records and I haven't caught it on one of the college radio stations. But I knew that Diamanda Galas was definitely from interviews, from zine coverage. There was this gender bending. There was a big, what is now called LGBTQ, a term which did not exist in that form at the time, connection, and a very, very big AIDS connection. She had done a series of 3 operettas called The Mask of the Red Death, I believe. Very active with AIDS stuff, with HIV rights. Remember, again, this is the 1980s. When anybody with HIV was especially icky, it was thought to be vengeance from God by a large portion of the United States. It was considered controversial to, in some cases, to hug somebody with HIV still, that sort of thing. There was a movement against funding research even. So a different world on that front. Oh, it's don't ask, don't tell era, or before that even, just dishonorable discharge era. Same-sex marriage was still illegal. There was no adoption. So things like that. Somewhat different world on these fronts. So Diamanda Galas, whose brother contracted HIV and eventually sadly passed of it, was very active in circles, probably with different ACT UP groups and different groups to raise awareness and deal with the issue of this plague. Anton LaVey is a holdover. We did have some figures in the 80s counterculture, subculture, who were holdovers both for good and bad, from the hippie era extending into the early 70s. One of this is Church of Satan founder Anton LaVey. This is a very San Francisco story for multiple reasons. Very big Bay Area story, because a lot of these zines are centered out of the Bay Area. I virtually knew my way around San Francisco, Berkeley, and Oakland in my head 15 years before I ever got there, because of just reading people's descriptions of I was walking on Telegraph Avenue. Eventually, a slappy fight begins in the pages, not of one zine, but of maybe 12 or 24 different zines between Church of Satan founder Anton LaVey and Diamanda Galas, where he's claiming that HIV is harmless. Now, this may very well, part of the reason I say that this is a very San Francisco story is because you had Peter Duesberg, outstanding investigator grant recipient, all this award winners at the University, at UC Berkeley, who was saying that HIV was not causal in AIDS. And the ACT UP San Francisco group, although I think there was a rival ACT UP Bay Area group in the heart and one of the two centers of gay America, the West Coast center of gay America, took the Duesberg angle on this. Diamanda Galas, it also turns out, has a biochemistry or some variety of high-level microbiology degree on top of everything else, compounding the total weirdness of all of this. So she was challenging LaVey to get himself injected with HIV and asking why Lord Satan wouldn't just protect him. Another layer of this is that I believe that LaVey was one of those Satanists who was using the construction of Satan as a philosophical construct and not like physical big guy with bat wings and a pitchfork. So there were levels of this, but this argument went on for a year or two, and it went on slowly through. You would have to read. I don't know that there was a single person in the world who got the whole picture and read all of the interviews and the back and forth, except maybe Diamanda Galas and Anton LaVey, because they know who they interviewed with where. They knew what was published where. They knew what letters they were sending back and forth. But the rest of us were sort of following this haphazardly. I don't know what the result of any of this is. LaVey is dead. He was older at the time, but very high strangeness, high weirdness playing out very slowly. Now you would do this, people would have diss tracks if they were rappers and would have exchanged gunfire by now. Or, you would have had people stitching each other's videos and somebody would have been ratioed by now and maybe we would have called it a day. This took a year or two. And I don't even know, I remember aspects of this clearly, but I do not remember any result. Welcome to the 1980s. That was a long one. They're not all going to be this long, folks. I promise. They won't all be this long. In ninth place, for many punk rockers, number 9 was Mommy and Daddy Fighting. And that is MDC versus Bad Brains. I do not remember the specifics of the story. I'll tell you that some of the people who probably don't remember the specifics of the story would be members of MDC and Bad Brains, or at least the ones who would have been at the center of the dispute. Somebody was selling somebody pot. I think Bad Brains were passing through Texas, or I don't even know that MDC had relocated to California yet. I don't remember that detail. Somebody was buying pot from somebody. The deal went south in some way, and there were recriminations on either side, but compounding this was the fact that Dave Dichter, and I don't know about other members of the band at the time, but at least Dave is or was bi, or identified as bi and or gay. I don't remember the specifics of that. And Bad Brains had, with especially one or two members, maybe especially HR, this Rastafarianism, which defined homosexuality as unnatural. Somebody in the pot deal going wrong, somehow it secondarily also became, was there a homophobic slur or not? I seem to remember most punk world zines seem to back MDC on this dispute. Everybody loved Bad Brains, so this was very painful for a lot of folks. They were also probably the most musically talented band in all of hardcore, so again, additionally painful for a lot of folks. And I don't remember a resolution to this. I don't know if there was ever a resolution. I don't know if anybody ever kissed and made up. I don't even know if there were 8 people present at the dispute. I don't know if it was 2 guys arguing. I don't know if there were more than 5 people in the world who are actually there and if they all have the same recollection of what happened. But it was a big time punk rock zine world kerfuffle for quite some time. And I think there were reverberations later on with some accusations of HR, either as a solo act or Bad Brains having made some actual or perceived homophobic slur. Again, I don't remember any resolution to this whatsoever, but I remember it being a thing. Number 8, I have a little pet name for this, but I don't know that the rest of the world does. I call it 6 Degrees of Skinhead. Basically, earlier in the 80s, it was pretty clear that skinhead, for most people, merely, especially in the United States, on the US side of the Atlantic, merely meant racists. It was punks versus skinheads in the sense of that there would sometimes be a small, but usually physically larger group of Nazi skinheads who might go to a very small hardcore show, especially one where there was no security because it was at somebody's yard or the Elks Club or whatever, instead of a bar with a proper bouncing staff, and try and beat up on some punks. Eventually, as the 80s went on, it became clear that there were some skinhead bands who were saying, we're working class, we're proud to be working class, which is not a phrasing that most Americans use. Most Americans do not identify. Most Americans, what's the phrase? They think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, which explains a lot of how people vote. There was an increasing clarity that not all skinheads are racist, and hey, you can look at the colors of their bootlaces and their braces. Again, Americans don't use the word braces, we say suspenders. But you can look at clues like that and tattoos and just how they're acting. And, you know, there should be punks and skins together, united for the punk rock and whatnot, except for these Nazis. Now, 6 Degrees here, I'm referring to, there would be accusations in letter sections that this skinhead band played with this skinhead band. Skinhead band A played with skinhead band B. Skinhead band B played with a racist skinhead band C. Did this have a transitive power where if skinhead band A plays with skinhead band B, is that as bad as playing with A playing with skinhead band C? This also very slowly would play its way out through letter sections. You would often also have these compilations that would be made where somebody would have like working class oi compilation, and there would be 1 or 2 bands that were either confirmed or alleged racists, and then the question would be what degree of culpability or awareness did everybody else on the compilation have, and maybe 1 or 2 of those bands would say, hey, we didn't put the compilation together, we just sent tapes in and said we'd be happy to be on it. We're not the responsible party, don't paint us with that brush. This again is all happening at the speed of stamps and mail. Issue number 7. The band Discharge goes metal, or maybe even hair metal. I have never heard these tracks, but it was a big deal that Discharge, who are one of your classic black and white graphic, anti-war, hardcore bands, considered to have one of the best drummers in the game, classic anti-war songs, hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing, that sort of thing. Absolutely classic British punk rock. There's a whole, I mentioned this on another video, there is to this day this whole diss bands subgenre of hardcore in which, you know, no matter how nonsensical the word is, if it begins with the syllable diss and they have black and white graphics, you know to this day what that band sounds like. Apparently Discharge went away for a year or two, or they weren't doing that well. There were bands that were getting signed, which is something that we'll talk about in a little while. And there was sort of a discharge mark too, where they came out, where they were trying to make it. They were trying to get signed as an alternative or a metal band. They grew their hair out. They had big hair. There was a publicity photo that was taken, like a black and white, put this in the newspaper publicity still. And I remember this being reproduced in the letters section of Maximum Rock and Roll for the purposes of mocking them. I don't really much ever remember there being any photos or graphics in the Maximum Rock and Roll letters section. So this was a very big deal indeed. And we may have to have, I will have eventually one or more videos on how big Maximum Rock and Roll was in the pre-internet era for establishing tastes and being a center of communication, the nerve center of international punk rock. So for that to be happening was greatly humiliating to Discharge, who did not end up with a lucrative metal career. I also remember there were these subsidiary letters from at least one member of the band. I think they ended up breaking up. And the one guy was saying basically, I didn't want to do it and they made me do it. And then people were sort of laughing at that, saying, you're an adult. How does anybody make you grow your hair out like you're a member of Motley Crue and wear this ridiculous clothing and pose for these photos? You could have said no. You could have just not done it. That's good advice for all of us all of the time, isn't it? You could have said no. You could have just not done it. Words to live by. If you learn nothing else from 40 years, 45 years of punk rock, learn that. Okay, number 6 is Maximum Rock and Roll again. So Tim Yohannan, who I did get to talk to on the phone once or twice, definitely once. Tim Yohannan is probably the most important person in the last 50 years of alternative music. I'm going to say 45 years at least. He was the mainspring behind Maximum Rock and Roll. His house became the Maximum Rock and Roll Publication Center and also became this probably the world's greatest repository of punk rock music releases, mostly on record, some CDs. There would be bands, most of them more higher profile bands, at least medium profile in the punk world bands, that would stay at the house if they were touring. And I think radio shows were recorded there and that sort of thing. And people could listen to these records. And it was this mass sort of shared library, sort of Tim's personal record collection, sort of the punk rock repository that was semi-public. And apparently he would use green tape on the spines of records, I guess to mark them as his or the library's. And also to keep them, I don't know what he was doing with the green tape. This was described in words in his zine. But I know that there was green tape on the records. And some portion of some of the very valuable ones went missing. Now, a lot of these records today on Discogs would go for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a piece. At the time, they were probably selling for a couple $100 even a piece, which was unheard of. Those were crazy prices, especially considering inflation, if you go back 30, 35, 40 years. But these records went missing, and it was pretty obvious that either somebody working in the Maximum Rock and Roll house, or it was suspected, more likely, certain members of touring bands stole records from Tim's collection. He was asking for them back. The zine was asking for them back. I think a couple were eventually recovered because they were sold to record stores and they had the green tape on them, which was the telltale sign. Sherlock Holmes finds the clues. So this was a thing. I remember that being a thing, probably in the 80s, late 80s. Anybody else recall? Leave it in the comments. Issue number 5, Maximum Rock and Roll reduces its music coverage. This may have happened in the early 90s or around 1990. This is around the same time that Nirvana breaks big, grunge breaks big, but also indie labels in general. A lot of them got big. A lot of them, punk rock, hardcore especially, did such a great job of spreading the message organically, and it connected with so many kids that there were more shows, there were more subgenres, there were a lot more people flooding in. A lot of these people flooding into alternative and underground rock. A lot of them no longer sounded like hardcore. A lot of them sounded more like mainstream rock, or they went off in some very unique directions. rock-ish, maybe jazz influenced, or just plain old noise directions. There were 1,000 flowers blooming. And this was happening in the late 80s into the 90s. And the labels, the for-profit labels, took notice and realized that all of this work that these kids were toiling to do in obscurity for so many years created a market. It created a demographic market of Gen Xers and slightly younger than Gen Xers who would buy your weirdness that you put out. And we're getting less picky about its provenance in terms of, because there were people coming to shows that were now in bars that were for profit, or larger shows that had 500 or 1,000 people that were ticketed, maybe Ticketmaster's getting involved or its equivalent. You're getting the shows with bouncers, definitely more than before. You're getting unpopular rock. I've said this as a joke, but it's only half a joke. It's a sardonic joke. You know, in 1985, you could have been in an underground band in the Western world. If you're in Britain, the former West Germany, the United States, Canada, Brazil, you could be in an underground band. You could be in an alternative band because the lifestyle was alternative. This was something that hardly anybody was doing. Now, you're playing a show to 50 people. You, my friend, are in an unpopular band. There is nothing about the style of music which makes it any less popular. In fact, a lot of hardcore and punk rock stuff these days is more popular than a lot of areas of jazz, a lot of areas of neoclassical music, that sort of thing. Demographically, you are no longer an alternative to anything. There is no longer necessarily, there often is. I don't want to denigrate anybody who's doing it their own zine right now and still running it off on a photocopier at the copy center. I don't want to denigrate anybody who's still doing a show in their backyard with no bouncers to 50 kids and collecting as was more common around 1988, collecting a canned food for the homeless as a requirement to get in with your $2. I'm not denigrating anybody who's still doing that. You are still providing an alternative. However, there's nothing about the sound of the music which is any longer alternative when it's on, alcohol commercials and jeans commercials and on, whatever the equivalent of MTV is that actually plays music videos now. There's nothing about listening to loud, fast rock. It no longer means anything. And the corporate world knows that. And, it's long past time that we recognize that. It's been folded into the larger culture. It's no longer a subculture or an alternative culture in and of itself, unless you are living in a way that is consciously alternative. It is no longer an alternative really to anything, and in some ways is definitional. I mean, the any idiot frat boy, they're listening to loud, fast rock music. They weren't in 1986. They were listening to post Peter Gabriel Genesis in 1986, but the same idiot is now listening to something that sounds like Nirvana or Nirvana. So it's meaningless now in many ways. And it's part of the reason that I still have this focus on what was coming out at the time, because of its organic nature and the fact that I like music to connect emotionally. And for me, I have to know that it came from a place where I'm rooting for these people to hit that note, because they're not professional musicians and they didn't have a $500,000 recording budget for this album. Where I'm going with this is that Maximum Rock and Roll was a primary dependable outlet, in part because it was monthly. You knew it came out every month. You could subscribe to it. You know it would be on the newsstand every month. It had distribution. It had enough people working there, many of them as volunteers, most of them as volunteers, or virtually all of them as volunteers, that it was regular. And that was a very big deal before the internet became what it became. Also, if you're under a certain age, you should know that just because the World Wide Web was birthed in the early 90s doesn't mean that anybody was on it, and it doesn't mean that there was a lot on the World Wide Web that you could use as a practical source of information, particularly about alternative things. it's well into the 90s. It's well into the mid to late 90s before you could really start seriously promoting a band or that sort of thing on the World Wide Web, or there was enough of a community of people using it that that would be a practical or useful thing to do. Or that internet speeds were good enough that you could actually start listening to MP3s. It was a huge deal because it condensed a file to the size where it wasn't a wave and you could actually hear more than 5-second clips of a song that didn't take you 3 hours to download. Pre-internet for all intents and purposes until the mid-90s. And the zine, especially the ones with the built-in readership, the established ones that were voices that were trusted at grassroots, were a big, big deal. And Maximum Rock and Roll at some point starts getting, not only did you have grunge break, and not only did you have these bands that didn't really stand for anything, they were just sort of noise rock bands, not necessarily hardcore, not necessarily mainstream. They didn't sound like Aerosmith, but they were still more mainstream than Minor Threat sounded. So where were they? Well, they were alternative rock. You started to get commercial alternative rock stations in major and medium-sized markets that were only playing the new rock of the 90s. And you were starting to get a little bit of a question as to where the money was behind these mid-sized labels. And they were acting very much like major labels. They were also able to go to a zine like Maximum Rock and Roll or Flipside or some of the others that existed and buy full-page ads that they looked at as a total bargain. Whereas only the largest punk labels were able to afford a full-size monthly ad in these zines before. You were getting grunge, you were getting neo-surf bands, you were getting neo-garage bands. We're all getting hot. All of these were sending Maximum Rock and Roll's massive music review section their entries every month. Somebody came out with a demo tape, somebody came out with a 7-inch record, somebody came out with a CD. CDs were new. CDs were basically a new medium in terms of the average person having access to them. As digital recording and pressing prices and demo tape prices and everything else dropped, all of a sudden, a lot of bands who had to be together for 2 years in order to get a few songs on a demo tape or a split 7-inch record, suddenly all of these bands could put out their entire recorded output. All of a sudden, bands that had been together for 4 months had 15 songs, and they were available. They were putting them out on CD, which used to be prohibitively expensive for anybody except major labels. They were putting them on vinyl. And they're putting them on 7 inches, and they're releasing demo tapes got easier and cheaper too. The prices of all that dropped to the point where everybody's releasing everything. The umbrella, the tent of Maximum Rock and Roll's coverage area, it used to be cool that you had Butthole Surfers and you had MDC and Butthole Surfers, and maybe Nirvana puts out Bleach or something, you're going to cover that. And a neo-surf band and a neo-60s garage band. Maximum Rock and Roll is covering all of that. Now they're getting 500 submissions a month. It's a newsprint zine that was limited to about 64 pages. And then they doubled the size of the zine. It went from $1 to $2 to $3 and got thicker. And it got more expensive to mail. These were all pressures on it. They made the hard choice that they were going to focus on just pretty much 77 style punk rock, 80s style punk rock, hardcore thrash. They were no longer going to cover crossover metal type things. Even if you had a demo tape with 4 songs that you did in your bedroom, they used to review it at Maximum Rock and Roll. They might say, sounds a little too metal for most of our audience's taste, but they seem like cool guys, nice lyrics. Send them $2 for the demo tape. That wasn't going to happen anymore. They weren't going to take any neo 60s craze, Paisley Underground type bands. No more of them. No more neo surf. I had friends in a neo surf band. It was getting hot in the 90s. They weren't going to cover that anymore. No room. They were going to focus on hardcore, non-metal thrash, 77 style punk, UK 82 style punk, and that was going to be it. This was a big deal. They were also only going to take ads from releases that met those core tastes, which meant they were turning down a lot of money. Now, a lot of zines had to decide which way they were going to go. There were zines. Well, you know what? We'll talk about that when we get to number 1. Number 4, also related to Maximum Rock and Roll, why not the Punk Rock Bible? So the curmudgeon, the contrarian, the Christopher Hitchens type of the if not Jordan Peterson, a little bit of Jordan Peterson, a lot of Christopher Hitchens in his writing, but also probably what's funny is probably to the left, certainly to the left of Jordan Peterson, and mostly usually to the left of Hitchens, depending on the issue. That would be Michael Board. Michael Board was in a band out of New York called Artless. He was kind of a leftover from the hippie era, age-wise. Older, he would say wiser. And Michael Board had a regular column in Maximum Rock and Roll, which was called Michael Board Says You're Wrong, which tells you all you need to know. It was written in the style of the Ed Anger columns from the Weekly World News, and was kind of funny, and was great. It was great that it was there because he was the contrarian. He was the guy who was going to make anybody think, because he would have different takes on issues. And at some point, he got a teaching job, English teaching job in, I think, Japan. And then later, I think he was teaching in South Korea and possibly even Mongolia. But he got a teaching job in Japan and took a vacation from this. And he would tell us all about how Japan was different in this way and that way. Of course, a lot of what he's writing about, because he was like Mr. Free Love, Mr. Sex, Mr. Drugs, all of that sort of thing. And he would always be poking at the straight edge people, especially, or the Puritans when it came to sex issues. But he goes to Bangkok, maybe on vacation, or maybe a long way home eventually when he's going back to New York. And he wrote this column about paying a sex worker for sex. Maybe, possibly underage. I don't remember if that was specified, but definitely described as young. Well, of course, there was this massive uproar. And it turns out that the thing that he did, and I think he may have deliberately taken 2 months, so 2 columns later, to specify it, but he said, aha, I got ya. You all went after me for being a misogynist pig, for hiring, nobody used the term sex worker in the late 80s or whenever this happened. The word prostitute was being used. No, you all went after me, but I never specified that this was a female. It was not a female. He described it as a male or possibly even boy. I'm going back 35 or more, 40 years here with my recollection of this. And he's saying, so you got to throw all of your misogynist attacks. I hooked you. I basically pranked you on that. It actually happened, but it wasn't a female. It was not clear to me if it was what would be known as a lady boy, or if it were just a male prostitute. I'm not sure which. I don't recall. And I don't know that he specified, because he was being very cagey with his use of gendered language. He didn't use gendered language. He may have just said they, or just wrote sentences so there was no pronoun. Very cagey. This is also before people asked, what are your pronouns? So that really wasn't on the table either. Huge uproar. And it seemed like it was this big gotcha of, aha, I didn't tell you male or female, or, or somewhere in a spectrum of gender. But my outstanding question, which I still don't remember, and I was only just thinking about today, was, did we get any clarity on the age of this person? If there were any lasting effects from that, I don't remember how that one ended either. If anybody recalls, let me know in the comments. Number 3, I just wrote the word Krishnacore. New York hardcore. There were 3 centers of straight edge hardcore in the 80s. Originally just 2. Originally just Washington, actually that's a little unfair. We always forget Reno, Nevada. We always leave out 7 seconds. I should do a video about the unsung or the forgotten 80s punk and hardcore bands, and 7 seconds would definitely be on that list. They don't get no respect from anybody. I think that's partially because they were in Reno. But Washington, D.C. obviously gives birth to straight edge, and Boston had its massive straight edge. And then New York sort of comes around a couple of years later, and it goes, for my taste, in a very jock, my wife says, closeted homoerotic, interesting direction. I was never really interested. It also got very metallic. The sound got very metallic. But a couple of the bands and some of the old-time Lower East Side, genuine, actual New Yorkers, not suburban kids, but actual New Yorker scenesters, got hooked in by the Krishna movement. The Hare Krishnas, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, they used to go after hippies. They were still around, and they figured that straight edge kids, well, they were already down with a lot of the program, so why not let's get our hooks into there? And you ended up getting Krishna core bands. You had Shelter, you had, I think the Cro-Mags went that direction in their latter days. And it was there was kind of this debate in the letter section over whether or not this was cult behavior. I would say yes, because it was a cult. Or, big tent, live and let live. And that's the long and short of that. That seems to have gone away about as quickly as it came. It seemed to be around for 2 or 3 years. Some of those people might still be involved with the Krishnas, for all I know. Let me know in the comments. Issue number 2 was pay to play. Pay to play. This seemed to be largely to me to be a Los Angeles phenomenon. However, a lot of zines, a lot of the press, Flipside especially was in the LA area. I believe their mailing address for years was Whittier, California. I remember that specifically because if I'm writing for a subscription or to send an ad in or that sort of thing, I was writing to Whittier, California. I still don't know where that is exactly. I'm sure it's in SoCal because Flipside, Los Angeles. You would read about this practice because there were bands in this soup in places like LA where your punk venues may also be hosting metal bands. They may be hosting metal bands. They might be hosting hair metal bands. They might be hosting crossover bands. And a lot of those latter categories, there were mid-sized to large labels looking to sign people. Being on stage was considered by the club owners to be something so valuable to your potential career that they were not only not paying people, but we're actually asking people to pay as a precondition of being on a bill of bands that played, believe it or not. They were asking the bands to play the venue. And then only if a certain threshold of ticket sales came in, and then, whatever you got from your merch table would be the money that you would take back. So it became this risk. The risk went from, this is pure American crony capitalism. Capitalism is supposed to be a system of distribution of rewards based in risk. Seldom does that play out in the United States. It usually ends up being somebody pocketing money when you took all the risk, which is not even how Adam Smith described how things are supposed to go. The club owners put all the risk on the band's heads and also were saying for the exposure, you don't know if there's and it's true in a place like LA, conceivably, but not so much for these punk bands usually, more for the metal bands. There could be somebody who was going to sign you and to the standard, the Muppets standard rich and famous contract, which is usually a terrible contract. That's usually a horrible contract. Most bands go into debt on their first album and end up owing the label money. That's another story. But for a lot of these punk bands, playing that size show was making it. That's as far as they were going to go. So mostly in Los Angeles, possibly in other areas of California, maybe in New York, maybe Trenton City Gardens. I'm not sure if it got down that far, which was basically an extension of New York hardcore. And I don't know what was going on with this in London and Manchester or places like that. I have a feeling that maybe this wasn't happening, but definitely there was a whole thing around bands being asked about pay to play. It was in almost every interview, the way that 1 or 2 years earlier, Are You Straight Edge or Not was in every band interview. There were even people writing songs called Pay to Play, Ain't No Way I'm Paying to Play, that kind of thing. Which is funny because some of the bands, you know, by 1988, 89, you've got a band in Dubuque, Iowa that has a song about how they're not going to pay to play, when nobody was asking a band to pay to play in Dubuque, Iowa. That wasn't going to happen. But it's nice to know that they were against it, and there was a sense of solidarity. But definitely a thing. Definitely a thing. Who else remembers this? Finally, for number one, I have the big enchilada, the whole thing where everything changes and life is never the same, and where we go from, as I said earlier in this marathon video, we go from the you're in an alternative band to you're in an unpopular band, and that is everyone gets signed. Everybody gets signed. The way it's usually standardly said in the mainstream, the rock canon historians will say that Nirvana broke punk, which they didn't do at all. They did not do that. They broke something called grunge, and they were also a little late in the game. Now, Nirvana was the biggest band to go from relative obscurity to getting signed to, in their case, Geffen. But Nirvana was far from the first. There were other bands getting signed, and there were others that were actual either punk bands or noise bands. Butthole Surfers were getting signed to mid-sized labels, and then bigger indies, and then major labels. You had Green Day. To me, Green Day is the big one. To me, Green Day is the hot topic. Look, Mom, I got spiky hair, but I'm still safe. Non-committal, non-political, hardcore betrayal. To me, Nirvana was always just sort of this noisy rock band that didn't have much of any connection to anything and any alternative. For me, the dagger in the heart was Green Day, and I didn't even like them. But Green Day came out of this whole the 924 Gilman Street scene, which was out of Berkeley and connected to Maximum Rock and Roll, and was very grassroots. And Lookout Records, which was run by an older hippie-aged columnist of Maximum Rock and Roll who went by the name Larry Livermore because of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories at UC Berkeley. This is, again, everything is dripping in San Francisco and Berkeley for those of us who lived 2,800 miles away. I did not even get to California. Actually, the first time I got to California was for work, and it was in Central California. I didn't get to San Francisco, Berkeley area in my life until I was in my upper 20s. Till sometime well into the 90s, almost 2000. I've been a few times now. And I felt like I knew a lot of these places already because I was reading about them in zines since I was 12 years old, 13 years old. In any event, Lookout Records, which went very cutesy. There was something that happened with the graphics and the lyrics, the images, the artwork, the Macintosh computer fonts of Maximum Rock and Roll, and especially Lookout Records. It all went in a very cute direction, a very safe direction. It was hot topic level rebellion. There weren't really political songs. There was a lowering of the age of the people in the bands. A lot of these people were still living at home, I think. They were playing, but everything was just much safer. And in that environment, a lot of these people had permissive hippie parents. It is just such a radically different thing to be growing up in a working class family on the East Coast and in 1985, and I'm a punk rocker, and you're gonna get the crap knocked out of you by your parents, by siblings, by people on your block, by people who hate and fear you. And in 1992, to have green spiky hair in Berkeley, California, that's a very different thing. That's, I think, a very different experience. And it shows in just everything. But Green Day had this sound that was radio friendly. They get signed. And that's what upturns the apple cart. Now punk that's where punk has broken big. Not grunge, not Nirvana's relatively radio friendly rock. Punk has broken at that point, and then you have the tears. Now you have the tearing of the fabric. You had this huge community that was built up for 10, 12 years of people who were doing things in the pre-internet era with a lot of trust, You know, they're going to drive 250 miles to meet somebody that they only know from a couple of expensive long-distance phone calls and a few letters, and they're going to hope that there's going to be enough people at the Elks Club that they're going to have gas money and money for 4 hot dogs so that they could get to the next place on the tour through entirely unfriendly redneck country, driving through the United States, hoping that cops don't pull them over and arrest them for the way they look, or that, you know, or that they don't get beaten, or, my God, in a section of Philadelphia, somebody pipe bombed a show that Kennedy's played. I know a guy who played the show. He was I know a guy from Autistic Behavior who was at that show when the bomb went off. They were one of the opening bands. And, you know, I've gotten the story directly from him. It's amazing. The people, kids in the community pipe bombed the venue in a working class neighborhood in a major city. When would that have been? Around 82 or 83? So, you know, to go from there to 92 or 93, and it's not a big deal to have green hair. And, you know, people are like, oh, look, you cute punk rock mom, that sort of thing. Entirely different world. But there was this tearing where people started taking sides. Who's going to stay friends with whom? Are you still going to... This zine isn't taking your ad anymore because you're bringing in too much money and you've got a pop punk sound. We're calling you sellout. One side is calling the other sellouts. The other side is calling the others Puritans and saying that they're too political and they live like monks and they're not fun. And you start to get this tearing, and things have not been the same since. That needs its whole own video, and this video has been long enough. But those were the first 10 things that sort of came to mind. I knew I could do this as a dump, just off the top of my head without having to research too much. Perhaps you could argue I should have researched a few things. What did I forget? What do you remember? Was this good history for you if you're below my age through no fault of your own? I don't blame you if you're younger than me. Hell, I'm envious. We're all envious of you in multiple ways. You actually have ways of telling what a record sounds like before you buy it. That alone, I'm envious of you. You could write an email to a band, write to their Bandcamp. Jeez, I had to send a letter and wait 2 months, or it would never get there. So I'm envious of you. But let me know if you liked the video. Let me know if you want more of this kind of content. Let me know what your favorite punk rock controversies of the 80s or early 90s were. Let me know what I missed. Let me know if I liked it. As always, like and subscribe. This is Chris from Punk and Paisley after this marathon recording session, and I would like to encourage you to keep on rocking in the unfree world.